Welcome to this episode. Today we are stepping into the world of Versailles, of powdered wigs, of candlelit ballrooms, and of one of the strangest deaths in the history of classical music. Our subject is Jean-Baptiste Lully, the man who essentially invented French opera and who ran the musical life of the court of Louis XIV for more than 3 decades. Lully was born in Florence in November of 1632, the son of a miller, and he died in Paris in March of 1687 at the age of 54. In between those two dates, he wrote around 13 tragedies set entirely to music, roughly 30 ballets for the royal court, a whole string of what the French call comedy ballets, written together with the playwright Molière, and a considerable body of sacred music, including motets, a miserere, and the famous hymn of thanksgiving known as the Te Deum. He invented an entirely new French way of making theater with music, one that combined singing, orchestral playing, and dance into a single continuous spectacle. And that model shaped opera in France for the better part of a century after his death. Geographically, Lully did not travel a great deal in the way we might imagine a modern touring musician doing. His life was really split between two places: Florence, where he was born and spent his childhood, and Paris, together with the handful of royal residences surrounding it, such as Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Fontainebleau, Versailles, and Chambord, where the court would move throughout the year and where many of his works had their first performances. He made essentially one enormous journey in his entire life, from Florence to Paris at the age of 14, and he never went home again. On the personal side, Lully married once to a woman named Madeleine Lambert, the daughter of a well-known singer and composer, and the couple had 6 children who lived to adulthood. 3 of his sons went on to hold his old position at court after his death, which meant that the Lully name continued to dominate French court music for another generation. As we will see, though, his family life sat somewhat uneasily alongside his personal reputation, which by the end of his life had become genuinely scandalous in the eyes of the king he had served for so long. Now let us go back to the very beginning, to a barefoot boy busking with a violin on the streets of Florence. Chapter 1. Childhood and Youth. We actually know surprisingly little about Lully's earliest years, and what we do know comes mostly through the lens of the extraordinary event that ended his childhood and launched his career. He was born Giovanni Battista Lully in Florence, to Lorenzo Lully and Caterina del Serra, a family that made its living milling grain. This was not a musical or aristocratic household by any means. Some accounts suggest his mother died while he was still a boy, and that he was sent into some kind of domestic or menial service afterward. What we can say with more confidence is that he picked up music early and largely on his own. He later told people that a Franciscan friar had given him his very first lessons, teaching him some rudiments of music and how to play the guitar. He also taught himself, or was taught somewhere along the way, to play the violin, and by his early teenage years he was already something of a street performer, the kind of clever, quick-witted young busker who could draw a crowd. That skill is exactly what changed his life. During the carnival season of 1646, when he was 14 years old, young Giovanni Battista dressed up as the stock comic character Harlequin, and he was clowning around and playing his violin for the crowds of Florence during the Mardi Gras festivities. As it happened, a French nobleman named Roger de Lorraine, the Chevalier de Guise, was passing through the city. He was looking for a native Italian speaker who could serve as a conversation companion for his niece back in Paris, a young woman named Anne-Marie Louise d'Orléans, who is much better remembered today by her nickname, the Grande Mademoiselle. She was Louis XIV's first cousin, the daughter of Gaston d'Orléans, and she wanted to keep up her Italian. The Chevalier de Guise liked what he saw in this clowning, violin-playing teenager, and he simply took him back to Paris with him. So overnight, a miller's son from Florence found himself living in the household of one of the most powerful women in France. From 1647 to 1652, the young Lully served the Grande Mademoiselle as what the French called a garçon de chambre, essentially a chamber servant, though some slightly less flattering accounts describe him at various points as little more than a lackey or even a kitchen boy before his talents were noticed. Whatever his exact job title, what mattered was that he was now surrounded by professional musicians in her household, people like Nicolas Métrou, François Roberdet, and Nicolas Gigot, and he studied with them, quickly developing into a genuinely accomplished guitarist, violinist, and dancer. His energy and his agility earned him the nicknames Baptiste, and, even more colorfully, Le Grand Baladin, which translates roughly as the Great Street Performer or the Great Tumbler. It is a nickname that captures something real about him. Even after he became the most powerful musician in France, he never entirely lost that background as a performer, a mimic, and a showman. There is a small but telling detail from this period that historians love to point out, because it is genuinely funny. Descriptions from the time paint a picture of a strange little figure slipping through the corridors of the Louvre Palace, a boy described as thin-bodied but with an oversized head, hungrily soaking up all the new music being performed at court. It is not a flattering image, but it is a vivid one, and it shows us that even as an awkward teenager, Lully was already positioning himself to be wherever the interesting music was happening. It's worth pausing here to reflect on just how unusual this path was for the period. In 17th century Europe, social mobility of the kind Lully experienced was exceptionally rare. Most children born to millers stayed millers, or moved into some other equally modest trade. And the idea of a foreign-born servant boy rising to become the most powerful cultural figure at the court of the King of France would have seemed almost fantastical to anyone who knew him as a 14-year-old street performer in Florence. What allowed it to happen was a combination of genuine, visible talent and, frankly, a considerable amount of personal audacity. Lully was never shy about putting himself forward, about performing loudly and visibly in front of exactly the kind of people who might be able to help him, and about making bold requests, like asking to leave his employer's service rather than follow her into exile when he judged the risk was worth taking. This combination of raw talent and fearless self-promotion would remain a defining feature of his character for the rest of his life. His time with the Grande Mademoiselle came to an abrupt end in 1652. She had become entangled in a noble rebellion against the crown known as the Fronde, and as punishment she was exiled from Paris to the provinces. Lully, in what is honestly a remarkably bold move for a servant in his position, asked to be released from her service, quite simply because he did not want to leave Paris and go live in the countryside. Astonishingly, she agreed. That single decision, choosing ambition and the capital city over loyalty and comfort, set the entire direction of the rest of his life. Chapter 2. Life and Career. Freed from service to the Grande Mademoiselle, the teenage Lully wasted absolutely no time. Within months, he had caught the attention of the young King Louis XIV himself. By February of 1653, so barely a year after leaving his old employer, he was dancing alongside the 14-year-old king in a court entertainment called the Ballet Royal de la Nuit, the Royal Ballet of the Night. And within weeks of that, in March of 1653, he was formally appointed as royal composer of instrumental music when he was still only 20 years old. From that point forward, Lully's career was inseparable from the French royal court, and the story of his life is really the story of a court that moves seasonally between a handful of palaces. Paris itself, and specifically a converted tennis court, and later the Palais Royal Theatre, became his real professional home once he acquired control over French opera in the early 1670s. But the king's court moved constantly between the Louvre and the Tuileries in Paris, and out to Saint-Germain-en-Laye, Fontainebleau, Versailles, Vincennes, and Chambord. And Lully followed because that is where premieres happened and where the king wanted his entertainment delivered. In 1653, the king also put him in charge of a smaller, more agile string ensemble called the Petits Violons, the little violins, as distinct from the older, more traditional 24 violins of the king. This was a crucial early opportunity because it gave Lully room to experiment with new musical textures without having to fight against an entrenched, conservative ensemble. When Louis XIV took full personal control of the government in 1661, following the death of the powerful Cardinal Mazarin, he rewarded Lully generously. Mazarin, incidentally, deserves a small mention here because it was Mazarin who had originally imported prestigious Italian opera companies into France, which is really what planted the seed for French musical theater in the first place. With Mazarin gone and the young king now ruling in his own right, Lully was named superintendent of the royal music and music master to the entire royal family. And that same December, he was granted formal French citizenship. On the strength of this new status, he married Madeleine Lambert in 1662, the daughter of a celebrated singer and composer named Michel Lambert. When he registered the marriage, he described himself rather dishonestly as the son of a Florentine gentleman, when in reality his father had been a simple miller. The marriage produced 6 children who survived into adulthood, and it is worth pausing on the fact that Lully's own sense of identity had shifted so completely by this point that even the spelling of his name changed. The 1660s brought Lully his closest and, in the end, most complicated personal and professional relationship, his partnership with the playwright Molière. It began modestly in 1661 with a single song added to a play called Les Fâcheux. But from 1664 onward, the two men produced an extraordinary run of what the French call comedy ballets, blending spoken theater with song and dance. Together they created Le Mariage Forcé, L'Amour Médecin, Monsieur de Pourceaugnac, and most famously of all, Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme in 1670, along with the tragedy ballet Psyché in 1671. Lully clearly relished performing in these works himself. His most celebrated comic role was the pompous, invented Muslim cleric called the Mufti in the Turkish ceremony scene of Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, a role so beloved that he was asked to perform it again at court in 1681, more than a decade after the piece premiered, purely at the king's personal request. But this famous partnership ended badly. In 1672, Lully managed to acquire, essentially by outmaneuvering a rival named Pierre Perrin, the exclusive royal privilege to produce opera in the French language. He immediately used this new monopoly to restrict how many singers and instrumentalists any competing theater, including Molière's own company, could employ. This effectively made it impossible for Molière to continue staging his elaborate musical comedies. It is worth saying that Lully had his own grievance here too. Molière had staged their joint work Psyché in Paris the year before without paying Lully anything for the music. So from Lully's point of view, this was not simply an act of cruelty, but also a kind of payback. Whatever the justice of it, the friendship was over. Molière turned instead to a younger composer named Marc-Antoine Charpentier, and in one of those strange twists that seem to belong more in fiction than in real history, Molière died suddenly only a few weeks after Lully's first actual opera had its premiere. There is another important thread running through this period worth pulling out on its own, because listeners who know their opera history will be curious about it. The sheer machinery Lully built around himself at the Académie Royale de Musique. Running an opera house in the 1670s and 80s was not simply a matter of writing scores. Lully had to manage singers, dancers, set painters, machine operators who handled the elaborate flying gods and sea monsters that 17th century audiences loved, seamstresses, and an entire administrative staff. And he did all of this while also composing roughly one new opera almost every single year for over a decade. The pace alone tells you something about the man's stamina and his appetite for control. He did not delegate creative decisions easily. Contemporary witnesses describe him attending rehearsals personally, correcting singers on the smallest details of pronunciation and phrasing, and even adjusting the pacing of dance numbers based on how a scene felt in the room, rather than simply handing a finished score to his performers and walking away. This obsessive attention to detail extended to how Lully protected his monopoly. The royal privilege he had acquired in 1672 gave him an extraordinarily strong legal position, and he used it aggressively. Any theater company in Paris that wanted to use more than a very small number of musicians was required to get his permission first, and he was famously unwilling to grant it to genuine competitors. This made him extremely unpopular among other musicians and theatrical producers in Paris, many of whom saw him as having strangled the wider musical life of the city in order to protect his own personal empire. And yet, from a purely practical standpoint, this same ruthlessness is precisely what allowed him the artistic freedom to develop the tragédie en musique into such a fully realized, coherent art form. Without exclusive control over an enormous, well-funded institution, it is hard to imagine he could have achieved the same consistency of vision across 13 major operas. That first opera opened the most important chapter of Lully's career, his 11-year partnership with the playwright and poet Philippe Quinault. Quinault was a cultivated writer who had spent time in fashionable literary salons, and crucially, he was willing to break away from the traditional 12-syllable Alexandrine verse that dominated French tragedy, using instead shorter, more flexible lines that were much easier to set to music. Together, starting with Cadmus at Hermione in 1673, Lully and Quinault essentially invented a brand new genre, the tragedy set entirely to music, what the French later called tragédie lyrique. The reception of that very first opera was so triumphant that one of the few critics who genuinely admired Lully, a writer named Saint-Evremont, wrote that Monsieur de Lully had debuted with a masterstroke. Over the following 13 years, Lully and Quinault built up an extraordinary catalog together. Alceste in 1674, Tissé in 1675, Attis in 1676, Isis in 1677, Bellerophon with other writers in 1679, Proserpine in 1680, Persée in 1682, Phaeton in 1683, Amadis in 1684, Roland in 1685, and finally in 1686, Amide, which is widely considered their masterpiece and the high point of the entire genre. What made this partnership so influential was not just the number of works, but the way Quinault's writing directly shaped Lully's music. Quinault developed something the French called the divertissement, a set piece within each act combining chorus and dance that on the surface looked like pure celebration, but that Quinault often used to smuggle in irony, social commentary, or even foreboding about what was coming later in the plot. Lully matched this with subtle musical devices, shifting keys, changing meters, altering orchestral textures, so that the audience could feel that something was slightly off, even in the middle of an apparently joyous wedding scene or a victory celebration. Once installed at the top of French musical theater, Lully ran his empire with genuine ruthlessness. He trained his own singers and his own orchestra personally, and he demanded a level of precision and dynamic nuance that was almost unheard of at the time, when most ensembles simply alternated between loud and soft with no real subtlety in between. Contemporary accounts describe him flying into a real fury and leaping out of his chair to scold any singer who dared to add an unauthorized musical ornament to their line. He apparently beat time so violently with his long wooden conducting staff that it wore an actual permanent notch into the wood of his podium, a detail that becomes darkly ironic once you know how his life ended. Among his own pupils, the talented young composer Michel Richard de Lalande was flatly forbidden from writing anything for the theater, because Lully had reserved that entire territory for himself and guarded it jealously. He was also, by most accounts, genuinely shrewd with money. He used his royal monopoly to build up considerable personal wealth and property, which put him in a very different financial position from many struggling musicians of his era. There is even a well-known, slightly blunt line repeated in accounts written for younger audiences today. Simply that Lully was rich when he died. In an age when composers often depended precariously on noble patronage, Lully had turned himself into something closer to a wealthy businessman who happened to also be one of the greatest musicians in Europe. His personal reputation, however, grew increasingly troubled in his final years. After Queen Marie-Thérèse died in 1683, and after Louis XIV secretly remarried the much more devoutly religious Madame de Maintenon, the entire moral atmosphere at court shifted. The king grew visibly irritated with what contemporaries called Lully's dissolute lifestyle, including his relationships with men. In 1685, matters came to a head when Lully was formally accused of improper conduct with a young page living in his household, a boy named Brunet, who was removed from the household following a police investigation. Lully himself escaped any formal legal punishment, but the king made his displeasure unmistakable in a very pointed way. He simply declined to invite Lully to present his newest opera, Armide, at Versailles the following year. For a man whose entire identity and career had been built around royal favor, That quiet snub must have stung far more than any official punishment could have. Chapter 3. Final Years. Here is something that might surprise. Lully never really retired in any sense we would recognize today. There was no gradual winding down, no farewell tour, no graceful step back from public life. He simply kept working, right up until the final weeks before his death. In his last years, he did appear to be turning more of his attention towards sacred music rather than opera, and some scholars who have studied his final theatrical work suggest he might have been planning to alternate serious tragedies with lighter, more comic pieces going forward. Although we can never know for certain what direction he would have taken, because his life was cut short so suddenly. The end came in a way that almost sounds invented, except that it is very well documented by multiple contemporary witnesses. In January of 1687, Lully was conducting a performance of his own Te Deum at a church in Paris, celebrating the king's recovery from a recent surgery. Remember that detail from earlier about the notch worn into his conducting podium from years of pounding out the beat with his long wooden staff? During this particular performance, in a moment of almost unbearable irony for a man whose entire professional identity rested on perfect musical timing, he missed the floor and struck his own foot with the staff instead. At first, this must have seemed like nothing more than a painful accident, but the wound became infected and infected badly. His doctors apparently recommended amputating the toe to stop the spread of the infection, and Lully refused. The gangrene spread from there, and according to some accounts, eventually reached his brain. He died in Paris on the 22nd of March, 1687, at the age of 54, leaving his final opera, Achille et Polyxène, unfinished. It was later completed by one of his own students, a composer named Pascal Colas. It's also worth noting how differently death was understood and discussed in the 17th century compared to today, which helps explain why an infected toe could so easily become a death sentence. Antibiotics, of course, did not exist, and 17th century medicine had extremely limited tools for treating any kind of serious infection. Amputation, however crude and dangerous it sounds to modern ears, was often genuinely the only effective treatment available for gangrene at the time, which is exactly why Lully's refusal to have the toe removed proved so fatal. Historians have speculated about why he refused. Some point to simple fear of the operation itself, which in that period was performed without anesthesia and carried a very real risk of death from the surgery alone. Others have wondered whether his famous vanity, his lifelong identity as a dancer, as much as a composer, made the idea of losing a toe and permanently altering his gait unbearable to him. Whatever his exact reasoning, the decision cost him his life within a matter of months. He was buried in the church of Notre-Dame de Victoire in Paris, and remarkably, his tomb, complete with a marble bust of his face, can still be visited there today. One detail that has always struck biographers is that even as he lay dying, Lully reportedly took great care to put his considerable financial affairs in perfect order, ensuring a smooth and orderly transfer of his wealth, his properties, and his royal positions to his family. Even on his deathbed, in other words, he was still the same meticulous, controlling man who had once flown into a fury over an unauthorized musical ornament. Chapter 4. Musical Development and Historical Impact. To understand why Lully matters so much to the history of music, it helps to trace how his musical style actually developed over time, and to see how closely that development tracked his changing circumstances. His earliest instrumental writing grew directly out of the many years he spent composing ballets for the royal court before he ever wrote an opera. During this period, he experimented endlessly with dance forms, especially a repeating bass line structure called the chaconne. The chaconne that closes his Ballet de la Rivalry from 1659 already runs through more than 50 separate variations, and by the time he wrote Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme in 1670, he was even adding vocal lines on top of these same kinds of structures. This was a period of remarkably free experimentation, largely insulated from commercial pressure because it was all funded directly by the crown, and it gave Lully the compositional toolkit he would later put to dramatic use on the operatic stage. The real turning point in his musical development came with his break from Molière and his acquisition of the opera monopoly in 1672. Freed from the constraints of writing music to accompany spoken comedy, Lully and Quinault were able to build something genuinely new, an opera sung continuously from beginning to end, built on a kind of recitative modeled closely on the natural speech patterns of the best actors of the French spoken theater, rather than on the more florid, vocally showy style favored by Italian opera composers of the time. Lully is generally credited with inventing what became known as the French overture, a distinctive three-part structure that begins slow, moves into a fast middle section, and then returns to a slow closing passage. This form proved so influential that composers working nearly a century later, including Johann Sebastian Bach and George Friedrich Handel, continued to use it. He also firmly established a French style of recitative that stood in deliberate contrast to the dry, sparsely accompanied Italian recitative style, and he pioneered a tight, structural integration of dance directly into the drama of opera itself. This was a genuinely distinctive French choice. Italian and Venetian opera of the same period tended to push dance out to the intervals between acts, treating it as pleasant but essentially decorative filler. Lully instead wove his dance scenes directly into the unfolding plot, often loading them with hidden dramatic or emotional meaning, as we can see clearly in operas like Addis and Armide, where a seemingly joyful wedding celebration or victory party is quietly undercut by unsettling harmonic or textural choices in the music. We can track this stylistic evolution quite precisely. After his opera Tesée in 1675, Lully largely abandoned the overtly comic elements that had colored his earliest tragedies. The famous letter writer Madame de Sévigné described this shift memorably, saying it was done, in her words, to erase Venice, meaning it was a conscious rejection of the lighter, more comic Italian operatic conventions that Lully himself, ironically, had grown up with as a young Florentine. Around this same period, Lully also phased out the use of castrato singers in his choruses in favor of contralto voices, a further deliberate step away from Italian vocal practice and towards something distinctly and self-consciously French. The scale of Lully's influence across the following century and a half of European music is genuinely hard to overstate. Music historians often speak of a kind of glorious trinity. Lully, followed a generation later by Jean-Philippe Rameau, and then by Christophe Willibald Gluck, as together defining the entire tradition of French serious opera. Later composers as different as Etienne Méhul, Gaspare Spontini, and eventually the German Romantic tradition running through Carl Maria von Weber, Hector Berlioz, and Richard Wagner are all described by historians as drawing, in one way or another, on the foundations Lully laid down. Even his fiercest artistic rival, in a sense, could not escape his shadow. When Gluck composed his own version of Armide nearly 100 years later, reusing Quinault's original text, contemporary critics accused him of essentially copying the precise, natural way Lully had originally set that same text to music, which tells you something about how deeply Lully's declamatory style had become embedded in the French musical imagination. It is also worth spending a little more time on exactly how Lully's orchestra sounded, because this is one area where his innovations were extremely concrete and easy to describe. The core of his orchestra was built around 5 distinct string parts, rather than the 4-part string texture that would later become standard in the classical era. This included a top violin line, 3 separate middle voices roughly corresponding to different viola ranges, and a bass line played by cellos and the bass viol, sometimes called the viola da gamba. Around this string core, he added winds, including recorders, which he actually preferred over the newer transverse flute that was starting to appear elsewhere in Europe, along with early oboes that were still transitional instruments, somewhere between the older shawm and what we would now recognize as a Baroque oboe, plus bassoons, trumpets, and timpani for grand ceremonial moments. He also made use of plucked instruments like guitar, lute, and the large bass lute known as the theorbo, instruments that had strong associations with the more intimate court entertainments where his career had begun. This particular combination of instruments, and especially that unusual 5-part string texture, gave French orchestral music under Lully a noticeably richer, denser sound in the middle range compared to Italian orchestras of the same period, which tended to favor a simpler, more transparent texture, built around just two outer voices, a melody and a bass, with relatively little happening in between. Musicologists studying the period have pointed out that this thicker French middle texture, combined with the stately dotted rhythms Lully favored in his slower dances, created a sound that later listeners across Europe immediately recognized as distinctly French, regardless of who was actually writing the music. Composers who wanted to signal seriousness, grandeur, or royal authority in their own work, even outside of France, would often borrow this same combination of dotted rhythms and rich string texture, precisely because audiences already associated that sound with Lully and with the glory of the court of Louis XIV. Perhaps the most concrete and lasting piece of his legacy is institutional rather than purely musical. The dance company Lully, assembled in 1672 for his Académie Royale de Musique, was the very first permanent professional dance troupe of its kind anywhere. That same company survives today as the Paris Opera Ballet, which means that in a very direct, unbroken, institutional sense, Lully is the founder of a dance company still performing on stage right now, more than 350 years later. Chapter 5. Life Apart from Music. Away from the podium and the writing desk, Lully comes across as a natural performer who genuinely loved being at the center of attention, not just as a composer, but as a physical presence on stage. He danced in court ballets from at least 1652 onward, when he appeared memorably as a vendor of cheese tarts in a comic court entertainment. He seems to have had a real gift and a real fondness for broadly comic character roles, most famously playing Scaramouche, the classic swaggering braggart of Italian comic theater, in a ballet called L'Amour Malade in 1657, a work for which he also happened to write the music. Occasionally he took on more serious singing roles too, once performing as Orpheus in a court entertainment called the Ballet des Muses in 1666. According to a contemporary commentator named Le Cerf de la Vieille, Lully never actually received any kind of formal training as a dancer, yet he frequently choreographed dances anyway, and would sometimes simply get up and dance in front of his performers himself to show them exactly what he wanted, relying not on technical schooling, but on what this writer called an extraordinary ability in every single aspect of stagecraft. This hands-on, almost obsessively controlling temperament ran through everything he touched. He personally supervised the staging of his operas, the design of the sets, and the choice of costumes, which led one contemporary observer to describe him, only half admiringly, as a universal man and an absolute master within his own household. As for religion, it appears in Lully's life mainly as a professional obligation rather than as a source of visible personal devotion. He composed a considerable amount of sacred music over the years, including grand motets intended for the Vesper services and the daily private Mass of the King, as well as smaller sacred pieces likely written for a convent of nuns near his home in Paris. And of course, his very last major composition was itself a piece of sacred music, the Te Deum, the same piece whose performance directly caused his death, which gives the whole story an almost unbearably theatrical, symbolic quality, as if his life were constructed by a playwright rather than simply lived. But there is little evidence that religious faith shaped his actual personal conduct in any deep way. In fact, his reputation for what contemporaries called a dissolute life, including his relationships with men, and the scandal in 1685 involving the young page Brunet, sat in obvious and growing tension with the far more devout mood that settled over the royal court after 1683. Financially, as we touched on earlier, Lully was anything but a struggling artist. He used his monopolistic grip on French musical theater to accumulate real wealth and considerable property, a rare position of financial security for a Baroque-era musician, most of whom depended precariously on the whims of noble patrons. He died, by most accounts, a genuinely rich man. One more detail about Lully's personality deserves mention, because it captures something genuinely funny about him, even if the humor is a little dark in hindsight. Contemporary observers frequently commented on his sharp tongue and his gift for a well-timed, witty remark, sometimes at other people's expense. One later commentator, writing admiringly about him after his death, specifically noted that the king found Lully endlessly entertaining not only through his music, but through what this writer called his witty sayings, and that Louis XIV was genuinely fond of him and showered him with favors in an especially gracious way. This suggests that Lully's charm at court was not purely about musical talent. He was, by most accounts, genuinely funny company, quick with a clever line, the kind of person who could make an absolute monarch laugh, which in the tightly controlled ceremonial atmosphere of Versailles was its own kind of rare and valuable skill. It is worth remembering, too, that Lully's Italian roots never entirely disappeared from his French persona, even after decades in Paris, and even after he had built an entire artistic career, partly defined by rejecting Italian musical conventions. His very first ballet appearances included broad, physical comic roles drawn straight out of Italian commedia dell'arte tradition, the same tradition that gave the world stock characters like Arlecchino or Harlequin and Scaramouche. It is a nice piece of circularity that the boy who first caught the Chevalier de Guise's attention while dressed as Harlequin during a Florentine carnival would go on, decades later, to introduce dancing Harlequins and Scaramouches onto the stage of the newly built Paris Opera itself, effectively bringing a piece of his own childhood performing tradition into the heart of French royal culture. Socially, his most significant personal friendship was almost certainly with Molière during the 1660s, though as we have already seen, that friendship soured badly into open rivalry once Lully seized exclusive control of the very theater the two men had previously shared. His long working relationship with the writer Quinault, spanning 14 years and 13 operas, appears to have remained largely professional in character, though clearly productive and built on deep mutual understanding of what made French opera work. Within his own musical establishment, Lully was, by most accounts, feared rather than warmly loved. He ruled his singers, dancers, and musicians through strict discipline and at times outright intimidation, and yet several key members of his troupe, most notably the choreographer Pierre Beauchamp, maintained working relationships with him that lasted decades, which suggests that whatever fear he inspired, it coexisted with genuine professional respect and loyalty. Chapter 6. Where to find him today. If you want to explore Lully's world today, there are several very real, still active places and institutions where his legacy lives on. The most direct and remarkable of these is the Paris Opera itself. The institution Lully founded back in 1672 survives in an unbroken line as the modern Paris Opera, and its resident ballet company is the oldest continuously operating professional dance troupe anywhere in the world. When you watch the Paris Opera Ballet perform today, you are watching the direct institutional descendant of the very first troupe Lully personally assembled more than 3.5 centuries ago. The Château de Versailles also maintains a public history section devoted to Lully as one of what it calls the great figures of the age of Louis XIV, situating his career within the broader story of Versailles as a cultural and artistic showcase. For anyone with a deeper scholarly interest, the Centre de Musique Baroque de Versailles is the leading modern research and performance institution dedicated specifically to French Baroque music. It regularly programs Lully's works, publishes scholarly critical editions of his scores, and produces educational materials exploring the French orchestral tradition that Lully himself essentially helped to invent. On the performance side, several outstanding period instrument ensembles keep Lully's actual music alive in concert halls and opera houses around the world today. Groups such as Les Arts Florissants, Le Concert Spirituel under the conductor Hervé Niquet, and the German ensemble Musica Antiqua Köln under Reinhard Goebel have all recorded and staged Lully's operas and ballets in recent decades, which means his music is not simply preserved in dusty archives, but is genuinely alive in performance today. There is also a fascinating technical legacy worth mentioning here. Many of the actual dance choreographies from Lully's operas were preserved using a dance notation system that Louis XIV specifically commissioned his court choreographer to develop. Dance historians and specialist companies focused on historical reconstruction continue to study and revive these notated dances even now, giving modern audiences a genuine, physical connection to how these works actually looked on stage more than 300 years ago. There is also a dedicated modern organization, the Association Lully, a French nonprofit founded in 1998. Its purpose is to promote Lully's work and reputation and to prepare a scholarly, complete edition of his music, drawing on an international committee of specialists. For listeners who want to move beyond recordings and into original scores, research, and the long afterlife of Lully's music, it is the closest thing today to a society devoted specifically to him. For anyone planning an actual trip inspired by today's episode, it is worth knowing that the Church of Notre-Dame de Victoire in Paris, where Lully is buried, remains open to the public, and his tomb with its marble bust is still there for visitors to see in person. Versailles itself, of course, remains one of the most visited historical sites in the world, and its state apartments and gardens give visitors a very direct sense of the physical environment in which so many of Lully's works had their first performances, even if the specific theaters he used there have long since been altered or replaced. Now, for the question whether his music has ever appeared in film or television, the most significant example by far is a costume drama from the year 2000 called Le Roi Danse, which translates as The King is Dancing. It was directed by the Belgian filmmaker Gérard Corbiot and was based on a biography of Lully written by Philippe Bossan. The film stars Boris Terral as Lully and Benoît Magimel as the young Louis XIV, and it uses historically informed performances of Lully's actual music, recorded by the ensemble Musica Antiqua Con, as its soundtrack. The film frames the entire story as a kind of extended flashback from Lully's own deathbed, and it dramatizes his intensely devoted, essentially one-sided passion for the king, alongside his complicated friendship and eventual rivalry with Molière. It was nominated for a César Award, the French equivalent of an Oscar for Most Promising Actor, thanks to Boris Terral's performance in the lead role. Summary: Jean-Baptiste Lully rose from being a miller's son busking on the streets of Florence to becoming the single most powerful musical figure at the court of the most powerful monarch in Europe. A chance encounter during a carnival celebration brought him to Paris at the age of 14. His talent as a dancer and violinist won him the personal favor of the young Louis XIV, and his creative partnerships, first with the playwright Molière, and then, far more enduringly, with the librettist Philippe Quinault, allowed him to essentially invent an entirely new art form, the French tragedy set to music, along with musical innovations like the French overture that would influence composers for generations afterward. His personal life included a conventional marriage and 6 surviving children, close but ultimately fractured artistic friendships, considerable personal wealth built through his monopoly over French theater, and, in his final years, a scandal involving his private life that cost him the full favor of the king he had served so loyally for more than 30 years. And then, of course, there is his death, struck down by his own conducting staff while celebrating the very king's recovery from illness. An ending so strange and so darkly fitting that it remains one of the most retold anecdotes in the entire history of Western music. Lully's true legacy is not simply the roughly 13 tragic operas or the 30 ballets he composed. It survives in something far more concrete. The Paris Opera Ballet, still performing today, is a direct institutional descendant of the troupe he personally assembled in 1672. Every time dance and music are woven together seamlessly on an opera stage anywhere in the world, that structural idea traces back, at least in part, to the working methods this Florentine miller's son developed at the court of the Sun King. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the remarkable, occasionally scandalous, and ultimately tragicomic life of Jean-Baptiste Lully. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and rate the podcast. It really helps us.